Hi, my name is Alex Gervich. I'm one of the co-developers of Firefly. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can customize Firefly after you've made your own data so that you can make the user interface look however you'd like. Not quite however, but we try. The Jupyter notebook that I'll be going through is available online in our documentation and ships with the Firefly code in Firefly Notebooks Settings tutorial. So let's get started. So settings in Firefly are managed using a JSON dictionary with a bunch of different flags. To organize this and make sure that users and us developers don't forget what these keywords are, we created wrapper classes that'll do a little bit of validation and grouping of the keys just to keep everything organized. So in that spirit, there are 8 different groups in 2 classes. So in class, not in the Python sense, like class in the philosophical or like logical sense, I guess. Anyway, there are those settings which apply to the entire application and those settings which apply to a specific particle group. For each of these different classes of settings, there are startup and user interface settings. But for the application, there are also settings for the window and the camera, whereas for each particle group, there are filter and color map settings. We'll go over in detail what each of these things are throughout the video. So the first thing that we're going to do is create a settings instance and then use the print keys method. But we're going to set values equal to false because right now I just want to look at the names of the keys. If values were true, it would tell you what each of the settings were. So the way that it's organized, it's going to print all of the application settings first and then the particle settings. So for the application settings in startup, there are settings to, this defines the length of the velocity vectors. This is a flag for whether you should start in fly controls or not. The default is to start in trackball controls. The value for the initial friction, camera friction. So in another video, I'll have shown you what the friction is and how you can have the scene just kind of continuously spin. So you can set that here. A flag for whether you should start in stereo mode. A value for what the stereo separation should be, and what the total decimation should be for all of the data. These all have default values that match what you'll find online if you just go here and you look in here. But in general, they're sensible. i.e., the friction is some good number that when you spin it around, it'll spin a little bit and slow down. The decimation factor is set to 1, and stereo is disabled. There are flags for the UI settings. So this is to enable or disable entire panes or buttons. So this is a flag to, as a whole, enable the user interface. This is a flag to enable the full screen button, the take snapshot button, the reset to settings button, the save preset button, the load new data button, and then a flag for the entire camera controls, and then a flag for whether the decimation slider should be shown. This is pretty straightforward and really helps you control how much you want the user to be able to fiddle with some of the basic things that might make it so that the app stops functioning. In general, we leave all this stuff on, but depending on your audience, you may want to disable some of these. So it's like, for example, the snapshot, reset, and preset buttons would prevent people from saving and loading things from your file system. So say if like you were trying to run something for the public, like a table or something, you're sitting on the far side of the table, then people could spin it around and you wouldn't have to worry about them accidentally opening a file browser. Anyway, moving on. There's not much for the window settings. So here we can set the title. That's what shows here. The loaded attribute should not be changed, and in fact will raise an error if you attempt to. This just helps Firefly keep track of whether or not all of the data has been loaded in. It defaults to false because it has not. And then it will change in the JavaScript interpreter. And then there's an annotation setting which allows you to put a string of text that just lives up here to help you keep track of what your Firefly instance is. Moving on, there are camera settings for startup, where the initial center is, where the camera is, and the orientation of the camera. From there, we move to settings. We move to settings that affect each of the particle groups. And so these settings, instead of having a single value, will contain dictionaries that map particle group UI names to their values. So in the particles settings, there are startup settings for the maximum number of particles to show, whether velocity vectors should be shown, what kind of velocity vector, so either a line or an arrow or a cone, the initial color, how big the particles should be, and whether the particles should be enabled or not. You can also disable certain parts of the UI. You can restrict users from being able to see the UI at all for that particle group, whether the user should be able to drop down, like so use this little drop down button here, and whether the color picker should be allowed to change the color of the particles. Then there are initial filter and color map settings. So filters are enabled by default with just the limits set to the maximum and minimum values. But if you change the filter limits, that will affect the location of the ends of this. Oh, that's the color map. Same principle. That will affect the ends of this white bar, the location there. And then the filter vals will affect the location of the ends of the black bar. So you may want these in different places if you, say, want to start up your app kind of like this, but allow users to be able to drag the black button without having to type in something to redefine the filter limits. Likewise, there are color map limits and values that do the same thing with the slider, but also flags to determine whether that particle should have color mapping enabled, which color map should be which variable should be color mapped by, and whether the color bar should be shown. Or actually, now that I think about it, this is whether it should be like Viridis or something. Yeah. This is which color map to use. And this is the flag for whether it should be color mapped at all. The color bar is always shown once you select color map. So those are all the different settings.